All right. Hi, everyone. So we're going to begin. I'm going to introduce two of the speakers for today. First, I'll introduce myself, then I'll introduce the two speakers, and then we'll hear from someone else briefly, and then we'll begin the discussion. So my name is Yemane Charles. I'm a senior at AU School of Communications, getting ready to graduate last semester. I'm a public relations major, political science minor. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. You know, race, diversity, equity, inclusion, representation. These are all things that I deal with on a daily basis. It's a big part of my life. So I really love discussing it and getting the opportunity to hear from different people and, just open up the conversation and really just, um, I guess, get involved in the discourse. So I'm really glad to be able to participate in today's discussion. So first I'm going to now introduce the two speakers. First, we have Lauren Lumpkin. Uh, she is a local higher education reporter for the Washington Post. Um, she joined the Post in 2020 after a year-long fellowship on the education desk. Before coming to the Post, Lauren covered public school for the Capital Gazette and breaking news for the Baltimore Sun. She's previously contributed to The Nation, NBC Washington, and as an undergrad at AU, she was the editor-in-chief of the Black Print. And we also have Daniel Marks. Um, he is a 2019 to 2021 Harvard Ash Center Tech and Diversity Fellow. He is examining how COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter uprising has impacted Georgia's digital organizers in 2020. Daniel concurrently serves as a program manager for the Kairos, where he designs innovative digital organizing programs with a state-based organization. Previously, Daniel was a digital manager at Color of Change. Daniel graduated from American University in 2016 as a Frederick Douglass Distinguished Scholar and Public Policy and International Affairs Fellow. So we're really, really happy to have you both here. Thank you so much for participating. Um, and so we'll really just begin with a few questions. I'll ask each of you. I'll have questions directed towards, each person as well as both, and I'll really just specify that. But we really want, the conversation to just flow and be really open. Not too much structure. I'm just really grateful to hear from two people who were previously in my footsteps doing really amazing things. So thank you both for being here. So we'll start with Lauren. So you've been doing a lot. Your resume is really awesome. You have a ton of experience from being a Black journalist and editor-in-chief of the Black Print to covering local public schools and now higher education. So a question I have for you is, what has your experience been like navigating and building your overall journalism career?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on this panel. I'm really excited to be here and kind of talk about my experience and what being a journalist has been like for me. Obviously, when I was at AU, I was editor-in-chief of the Black Print, and I think that has formed really kind of the way that I approach journalism. I kind of came into the field, I guess, when the university was going through a lot of really terrible incidents. Like there was just like a hate crime, and there were like all these racist incidents, and they were like happening back to back. It was hard to be a student at that time. It was hard to be a Black person at that time. And, I, at that point, when I was with the Black Print, we were really just trying to make sense of this, like, how can we cover this in a way that really highlights these stories, that really uncovers like the systemic issues at play here. We felt like that coverage didn't really exist. And so that's how the Black Print really came to be. And I think that has kind of formed the way that I approach journalism, not just writing about an issue, but why is this issue happening? What are the systemic issues? Who is being impacted the most? Whose voices aren't being represented? And really trying to find, there's so much news, there's so much information out there. And so I think journalists now have to be really smart about finding the gaps. And I think that's something I did at AU, and that's something that I continue to do now, just figure out, okay, what's missing, who is missing from the story. So I've been at a lot of different, a few different publications and covered a wide range of topics. And I think just navigating and building my career, that's always been a really central thing for me. It's just figuring out who's missing from the story, whose voices are being underrepresented, who's being misrepresented, and trying to, build stories that are full and really humanize people.
Yeah, I mean, that's really awesome, very relatable. Being at AU in a time where, even after you graduated, there's still a lot of racial incidents and things going on campus, and just trying to figure out how to navigate that. I think storytelling is very crucial, very important, especially when you're dealing with the media. A lot of times, the voices that truly do need to be heard and are the front and center of the story don't have anything to do with the story at all and its creation. So I think that's really amazing that you're speaking to that, and a lot of what you do is trying to uncover these things and promoting those voices. So now I have a question for Daniel. In what ways has social media helped or hindered your field of work? And how do you see social media being used to empower and embolden people in terms of urgent campaigns of social justice?
Yeah, so first off, thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be back at AU and to get to talk about things that matter so much to me. To answer your question about the impact of social media is central to, our daily lives, even more so during this pandemic. I think we've seen the impact of social media tenfold, not only through our political discourse, but also through the amplification of issues. If you all remember last year, at the beginning of the pandemic, Breonna Taylor was murdered. And then by the springtime, George Floyd was murdered. And by the fall, we had the election. And by the top of 21, we had an insurrection. All of those issues were amplified over social media, and all of those issues would not have reached the magnitude and the discourse level that they would have had social media not existed. So I think, the pandemic has shifted the way that we interact with each other. I think it's changed the way that we organize. As you mentioned in my introduction, I am an organizer, so I often am dealing with the impact of what social media has on our daily life. And I think that as time progresses, we really need to interrogate the role that it plays even more. We need to interrogate the intersections of community, the intersections of misinformation and disinformation. We need to really interrogate how we are reimagining social media, and more specifically digital, so that we're using it to our advantage, because I think the pandemic has just drastically shifted the way that we use it as a communications tool, but also as a day-to-day tool, even in the way that we're hosting this event, right? Like, this isn't social media, but it's a digital tool, and digital has shaped the way that we interact with each other. And I'm really excited by that possibility. But I also think it just requires a little bit more thoughtfulness and a little bit more care. And I think that, we have an opportunity as diverse people to make our voices heard more than ever before. And I'm really excited to be imaginative during this era.
Yeah, that's awesome. Just a quick follow-up question to that. I mean, I think it's great you spoke to the intersectionalism of diversity of social media as a tool to get these stories and amplify these events across. Do you think as social media is beginning to or continuing really to develop and emerge as basically people's primary way of seeking out information, do you think there's room for censorship, or if there should be any type of censorship involved, or how do we kind of mitigate those issues, as social media can be used as a device to really polarize people and polarize issues. So you think there's any room for censorship there?
I think people are already using censorship, particularly conglomerate social media channels like Facebook and Twitter, but oftentimes that censorship disproportionately affects people that look like us. Instead of actually making the internet a safer place against white supremacy. So it's difficult and it's not my area of expertise, to be completely honest, but I think from a perspective of like organizing, um, censorship needs to be reimagined. I think we need to really interrogate what we can do and what we can have as organizers to hold tech companies accountable to make the internet a safer place for us all and eliminate barriers that perpetuate racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia. But I think oftentimes it just sticks to the whole point of censorship, and censorship as a model oftentimes just affects the people who are most marginalized in our day-to-day lives. So it's really challenging, and there's no, unfortunately, in my eyes, right way to approach it, but I can ask my tech accountability organizing friends and maybe get back to you.
Yeah, no, sounds good. I just wanted to kind of pick your brain on that because I think everyone's perspective does matter and they do differ in terms of how to approach that. So now a question for you, Lauren. Um, how do stereotypes representing Black culture and life impact representation in the journalism field? And what do you think that has evolved to like over time?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's so many stereotypes that I think exist about Black people and people of color, women, really any marginalized person. And they unconsciously affect the way that we think and the way that a lot of journalists operate and plan stories and write stories and create, their stories. And I think it's just super important to be aware of those stereotypes and be aware of those biases and constantly be challenging them. And when that doesn't happen, it does a terrible disservice to the community. I mean, if you kind of look back at more of like, I guess, the classical examples of, bias in the media, when someone is portrayed a certain way, when Black people are constantly portrayed as criminals or, lazy or poor or whatever. It is a disservice because not all Black people are like that. I mean, that's really basic. But when that narrative is pushed over and over again, that is what is, kind of assumed to be true. And it's terrible for all the people who, could be represented and who do deserve a voice because they're not being represented in the way that they deserve to be. And I think it's happening a lot more now, or not a lot more, but it continues to happen. I think we think, okay, it's 2021, like we're so evolved, and I think it's gotten better than like, I guess, like 1955, but the bar is so low that's not really saying much. But I do think now that, at least in my newsroom and my colleagues, people are a lot more willing to challenge themselves and to rethink those stereotypes and rethink those biases. Like I've had conversations with colleagues about, maybe I noticed something in their coverage or that is a little problematic to me, and the other way around as well. And I think those conversations can be really healthy, if they are approached the right way, if the intentions are good. And that's the benefit of having diversity in a newsroom in any space. You want people with different perspectives and different lived experiences to come together and help each other out and build much better coverage. But when you talked about stereotypes, like here's like a very recent example. When the vaccine started to be more widely available, there were a lot of stories like this. I wrote stories about this myself because I was covering kind of the vaccine rollout, particularly at universities. Universities were kind of converting their big spaces on campus to vaccine clinics, and Georgetown, Howard, schools that have hospitals in DC, they were hosting a lot of clinics and stuff like that. And I wrote a story about, I talked to Howard's president and presidents of a few other HBCUs. And the story that came out of those interviews was that Black people were very hesitant to get the vaccine. There's many examples of the medical disparities and racism in medicine. And a lot of Black people have very legitimate reason to be hesitant of a vaccine or be skeptical of the medical industry in general. And I think those stories, they have their place, but I think it took a long time for those stories to evolve past. See, there they are. Okay. I think if you can hear the dog, sorry. But and I think that kind of kept being repeated, even though I think there's a lot of truth to that, but also something that was being missed was that a lot of Black people want to get vaccinated, but there's like nowhere for them the access isn't there. It's not equitable. Even now, I mean, you look at DC and the, people who have been vaccinated in Ward 3 versus Ward 8, I mean, it's staggering. And so it kind of becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. If people are relying so heavily on the stereotype that Black people don't want to get the vaccine, then no one's going to question when Black people aren't getting vaccinated, when really the reality is that it's not accessible to them. And so I think now we're kind of digging into that issue, and I'm seeing more stories at the Post and at other organizations as well, really digging, like there was a front page story last week that two of my colleagues did, kind of looking at the issue, digging deeper into the issue, not saying that, and really what they uncovered was that the rollout was bad. And, the city didn't do a good enough job at targeting areas where a lot of Black people live. So I'd say all that to say that, when we rely too heavily on stereotypes, it can be a really negative thing, and we can miss whole chunks of the story. We can miss the truth when we rely on stereotypes, which are just kind of lazy and convenient for us to do, but it doesn't really serve anyone at the end of the day.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. I mean, I really appreciate the example with Howard University. That's right in our backyard, another university who, although it's a HBCU, I think, a lot of those similar issues are still present, still prevalent. So, thank you for that. A question for you both. I've been thinking a lot about, I guess, in the wake of 2020, and the whole Black Lives Matter movement and the way it's really been amplified. I've been really exploring like performative representation, and like the idea of organizations really profiting off of the movement itself, but the actions and their background, their employee body, not really representing what Black Lives Matter means, not really representing what diversity means, and almost like these, I don't want to say fictitious, but kind of fake corporate social responsibility, campaigns. You know, for example, with it's like a university saying, we care about Black lives and all that, but they only have 2%, of a Black population, that type of thing, or the way that they, handle and kind of navigate racial issues aren't that great. So how can you like, have this big statement and saying we support Black lives, but yet the actions don't follow? So my question for you both is, how do, I guess, organizations, mediums, how do we, and just I think us as a people, create more authentic, campaigns surrounding that?
I guess I can go first. I think often in my line of work, I think of organizations, in particular corporations. Uh, Oftentimes, corporate social responsibility lands at a press release and a nice image circulated on social media. And that is maybe step point five. I don't even think that's step one. Step one means action, because oftentimes I think the first step of action when it comes to social justice is equity in the workplace. Um, but I think I can give a specific example, particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement. There are so many corporations that jumped at the idea of, creating, images and statements and social media posts, mainly because they knew that doing so would lead to revenue increases, because that connection to social justice means awareness and, really targeting Gen Z and millennials. But you have to realize that that is performative and that it really takes action to make a difference. If you think about like what's happening in Georgia right now, with Governor Kemp enacting voter suppression bills, particularly like banning organizers and people in general from like getting water at the voting stations, which is ridiculous. There are opportunities for corporations to really work hard to supplement that. You know, Coca-Cola is the parent company of Dasani. If they wanted to, they could, in theory, give water to voters as a method of action. That is a step above, you know, writing a press release and creating a nice image of a person with a water bottle at a protest, you know? So I think, just to be brief, action and intention matter more than the press release or the statement. But it takes a lot of intention and it takes a lot of analysis to realize that. And I think that the 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 Black Lives Matter uprisings, although I was very happy that it happened, a negative side effect is performative activism and not really checking it enough and not calling it out enough.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up what's going on in Georgia, because I saw this. I'm just pulling it up because I saw this on Twitter earlier. But I guess the CEO of Delta Airlines, and he sent the statement, a video to employees of the company, kind of saying basically like, you know, yeah, like this stuff is going on, you know, this bill that is going to really negatively affect a lot of voters, a lot of Black voters. Like, okay, like we can't do anything about it, but he was wearing this like Black Lives Matter pin. And it's just like, you have to laugh, because if you really thought Black Lives Matter, then why aren't you like, you know, you are in a position to possibly make a lot of Black people's lives easier, but you know, you don't want to do it for whatever reason. So I mean, that's like kind of the definition of a performance, right? But when I think about this issue, like I think about it a lot in terms of universities, because that's what I cover. And so I think, you know, that's something that I've been looking into a lot now. Roughly a year ago, you know, a lot of institutions made a lot of promises when it was kind of popular to do so, because everyone was kind of making these promises and making these big commitments to diversity and inclusion and equity. And I'm really curious to see what has actually changed. I'm following some schools down in Virginia, like Washington and Lee and William and Mary, and the University of Richmond. My colleague just wrote about that school, but there's a lot of conversations, particularly at those institutions, because they have a lot of buildings and things like that are named after slave owners and Confederate officials or whatever. And so like, I think those conversations gained a lot of traction last year about whether these people deserve to have buildings named after them. And so now I'm curious, a year later, like what has changed, if anything has changed. And so I think as a journalist, it's my responsibility to hold those institutions accountable and say, hey, remember when you said this, what's going on with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. I think speaking to the Black community in general, I think that we need to hold organizations that first of all, we have way more fiscal and economic power than we realize in this country, and I think, you know, if we want to hold these corporations who make these bold statements and say, you know, we care about you guys, we care about your lives, we need to hold them accountable to that and make sure they stay true. And if not, I mean, the old-fashioned boycott that worked 40 years ago, I don't see why we can't bring that back and you know, bring power back to ourselves, because ultimately, you know, the dollar does have a lot of power in this country. And I think if you, the minute you take that away from a company, I think it's like a domino effect almost. So you know, I'm grateful to hear you both's insight on that. So now I want to ask you, just because we were talking a little bit about, you know, universities, um, how has your time at AU and your overall Black experience prepared you for the professional, you know, for your professional endeavors overall? And, you know, what advice do you have for, you know, incoming professionals who are getting ready to take that step forward?
I think, to me, I was a public communication major and a minor in sociology. So I, just to preface, did not know what I wanted to study for the first year and a half. I was all over the place because I was overly curious, but I landed on public communication really because I had seen organizing internationally in South Africa and wanted to use communication as a tool to uplift and to spread the word. organizing isn't a major. You can like mix and match to your best ability at AU. And I think the power of AU and the power of my major was the access to clients, particularly nonprofit clients in my like senior year. Um, Being super intentional about that type of work, but supplementing the learnings that I had with internships throughout my entire 4 years there, whether it was like the Human Rights Campaign or Advancement Project or the Raven Group. Like I was very busy and always really looking outside of the classroom to supplement my political growth. And I think that as a piece of advice to students, I would just say, particularly Black students, it's harder during the pandemic because you might not be in DC or things might be virtual, but definitely use the resources at AU, but know that the world is massive and you have so many opportunities to supplement your work, particularly if you're interested in like social justice and organizing and comms, through internships, through volunteering, through informal training as an organizer, and to make the necessary jumps to make your analysis stronger, because professors are very willing to meet you where you are. If you're interested in a particular issue, you can use like a public speaking class to practice. You can use a public relations portfolio class to practice that. So it's all on the intention.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think something that is pressed into a lot of us, especially I remember this being like a huge source of anxiety when I was a student, was like this concept of like networking and, oh my gosh, you have to network all the time. I think like that's a useless word. I don't think it really means anything. I think it just like strikes fear into people. I'm someone who's introverted, so it just like stresses me out. But what I wish I did know then is that don't approach it as networking. Don't approach it as just like meeting a whole bunch of people in the hope that you get a cool internship or a job or something, but identify people who you really admire, people who you want to learn more from, and be intentional about those meetings. Don't meet someone just to exchange a business card. Meet someone who you would really actually want to sit down and have a conversation with. And the fact that you're a student, like use that to your advantage. People love talking to younger people. People love talking to students. I love doing that because I was in that position not too long ago when I was like, didn't really know what I was doing and didn't know what I wanted. But there were so many people who, maybe I wanted to talk to, and I said, oh, it'd be so cool to talk to just this journalist, but I was too afraid to approach them. But now I've learned that people are actually more willing than you think to do that. So take advantage of that. If you're curious, don't be afraid to go and have like actual meaningful interactions with people, not just like those throwaway kind of network interactions.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think intentionality is really important. That's what I'm hearing from you both, and just going at everything and every opportunity, every relationship, very intentionally and with a goal of, building success around that. So, thank you for that insight. Now I wanted to ask you both about the workplace. How have you both, been able to find your voice in the workplace? If you have, what are some of those ways and tactics that you've developed to make sure your voice is heard? And if you haven't, like, how are you working towards that?
I guess I can start since I'm already unmuted. I think that, so I'm thinking about two different experiences. So like I got started, like after I graduated, I worked at newspapers that are very small compared to the Post, which is an enormous place. And I think it's been even, I've only been at the Post for a little over a year, and most of that time has been working from home. So it's been kind of hard to kind of figure out, okay, like where am I in the newsroom? But I think it helps to have like really supportive, like my editors are very supportive. I have great colleagues. So it's good to like find allies in your workplace, people who can, vouch for you, you can vouch for them. But I also think like kind of thinking back to other experiences in newsrooms that were a little smaller where, I think just through my coverage and the stories that I was interested in, I had to do a lot of really advocating for stories that I thought were important and for stories that I thought were missing, or stories that people who I think deserve to have their voices amplified in the paper. And that's kind of a hard thing to do, to advocate for yourself, but it's something that I don't think we're taught how to do. And it can feel really uncomfortable and feel really awkward, but you are, often your own best advocate. So it's, I would recommend kind of getting used to that now. And I think that's a good way to, find your place in an organization and find your voice, just being able to really speak up for things that you think are important. And that can be hard to do. But just know that you're in that space for a reason. It didn't happen by accident, or it wasn't random. Like, you were invited to that space, you were hired into that space for a reason, because someone there values your opinions and your thoughts and your contributions. So try to remember that when it comes time to speaking up for yourself. That's something that I'm still, training myself how to do, and it's really difficult, but it is important, because if you don't do it for yourself, then really no one else will do it.
I co-sign all of that. I think to add, I would say to remain intellectually curious. I think, especially as a young person, like your first 1 to 2 to 3 jobs, they're entry level, right? So oftentimes your bosses might be the people that you want to be as your mentor. So always remember that, the people that you're working with really are potentially your future. Like, you're looking at what is possible every day. But also, if you're in a non-traditional type of career trajectory like myself, starting as like a legal assistant and like ending up as a consultant slash researcher slash like fellow, sometimes what you want to do isn't like right in the line of sight. So it requires you to, supplement your learning outside of your 9 to 5. When I worked at Color of Change, I was busy, doing a lot of digital, but I knew that I missed writing and doing academic type work. So when my Harvard Ash Center fellowship came along, that's where the imposter syndrome jumped out. That's where the am I good enough feeling jumped out. And I think my piece of advice on handling that is, I think, to add to what Lauren was saying, like, you're there for a reason. And it's really important to not forget that, and to remember that no matter what your age and no matter what the environment is, you're there for a purpose, and you don't want to limit yourself based on preconceived notions on what society is suggesting. And to really just be bold. I always say, do the thing and think about it later. Unless it's irrational, don't do that. But like, dream your dream, reach out for the goal, and apologize if need be after, because if you're doing something radical or doing something innovative, you're likely going to receive pushback.
So I just want to follow up with that. I think at times, whether or not it is true, I think, especially when being maybe in environments where we are not the predominant ones, it can feel like we're a diversity hire, or like a tokenized contributor to the community, or that person that can just you can check off, all right, that's my diversity hire right there, check off that box. So like, I know I've felt that at times, at the university, and getting selected for internships. So how do you kind of navigate that? I don't know if that's a part of you both's experience, but maybe if you can speak to that, and if you have experienced it, how did you navigate it?
Hmm. I don't think I've experienced that firsthand, but I do think that being like the only person in a room, or one of a few, I mean, just like racism in general, comes with a lot of like paranoia, and that takes a huge mental toll on us. But there's been lots of times when I felt like, okay, am I only here because of this, because I'm Black, or because I'm whatever? Who knows if that's the truth? But I just feel like that's something that white people don't think about, because like that paranoia isn't baked into their experience the same way that it is for us. I think that like a lot of people of color experience imposter syndrome for that reason, like kind of thinking like, am I good enough? Like, do I belong to be here? Like, or I'm here by accident. Like, and at some like I always like kind of joke with my friends, like one day like people are gonna realize that I'm not actually qualified, and I like tricked my way into the Washington Post. But like I was saying earlier, like you kind of have to train yourself to think that, okay, it's not an accident. I'm actually because I deserve to be here. And I don't really know the answer to it. It's something that I think that a lot of people, like I said, people of color struggle with, and it's unfortunate because, you know, ideally I'd be able to pour myself into my work and not have to deal with these like anxious thoughts about, you know, whether I deserve to be in a space. I think that's really unfortunate. But I think with me, I'm just trying to, you know, be aware of those thoughts when they happen, kind of sit with them and unpack them a little bit, try to figure out where they're coming from, and remind myself constantly that this wasn't an accident. Like I'm here because my work is good and because I am dedicated and because I'm a good team player. I actually deserve the things that I have. So it's hard. And people ask me that a lot, like, how do you deal with imposter syndrome? Like, I don't know, there's no cure, but we try to, I guess, live with it and make the best of it.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add, but I'll definitely say I've intentionally sought out positions that have leadership that look like me. Every single job that I've had has been with a boss that is a person of color, whether it's the ACLU, Color of Change, or where I'm at, Kairos. It's either been POC led or queer led and you know, social justice oriented. The imposter syndrome to me more so lies because I'm in a people of color oriented space in age. When you are successful at an entry level or mid-level role, and then you get like a fellowship like my Harvard one, that was what caused the imposter syndrome because I was like, okay, I'm not afraid of being good at things. But when you are the youngest one in the room and the Black one in the room and a non-Black elite institution, that's where those questions that Lauren like addressed. But I agree, like I don't think there's a cure. I just think it requires a lot of mental work to remember that you're there for a very particular reason. And even if you are there because of your identities and the work that you do connected to those identities, so be it. Like, yes, I am the Black one and I'm going to do amazing because I am the Black one and no one else has the analysis level that I have. So even if that is the case, like it's a superpower. I accept it.
No, absolutely. I think that's amazing. So we're gonna open the floor now to some Q&A. I did want to ask one last question because I do think sometimes these conversations can, even though they're important, they can kind of go the negative route a little bit without talking about some of the solutions, positive change, and the positive things that are going on. And we, you know, I think these conversations should always be a balance, and they should, you know, always highlight both things, which are very much true. So I do want to hear from you both. What are some of the more positive changes you've all made and positive impacts you've had, not only in your workspaces, but you know, just in your field in general, in your communities? And yeah, what are some of the ways you've, you know, made positive changes? Or any just highlights you might have that you want to share?
Um, I think a positive highlight I've had in my career as a digital organizer definitely was during the George Floyd like murder situation. Like that was, of course, very, very mentally exhausting and terrible. But I think um, I'm really proud of being a source of amplification after he was murdered. Like in my role at Color of Change, I created the short code Floyd to 55156 that was all over the internet. And I didn't think it was going to lead to an uprising or like be the catalyst, but we went from like 400,000 people on our SMS list to over 7 million in a matter of like a week and a half. So being like an impetus for people to take action on something, I think just like gave me the validation, not as like personal validation, but validation in like the movement space that digital is really, really important and that technology and like Black organizing is effective.
I think some of my proud moments, like obviously the Black print stands out for me. It was just it's something that I remain very proud of. It came at like a really important time, I think, at AU. It's still like going strong. So I'm proud to see that like people are still involved with the Black print. But I'm just really grateful that I had the chance to come together with other Black students on campus who were passionate about writing and passionate about journalism to create a space that didn't exist at the university. And then even now, like kind of in my career, like I'm grateful that I'm very grateful to work in a place and work with people who respect me and respect my input. That's not the experience for a lot of people. And so like last fall, a colleague and I like kind of pitched the series about historically Black universities. And I think at some publications, like people would have really had to fight for that. I mean, I think kind of like in the sphere of like higher education and education coverage, like HBCUs are seen as this like kind of like niche, like special interest type of topic. And it's like, no, these are like the oldest universities in our country. They deserve just as much coverage as like the Harvards or the other really old institutions that are really like the cornerstone of our higher education system. And I think kind of historically, like I said, they've been treated as kind of a one-off. Okay, we did our HBCU story, let's move on. But when a colleague and I wanted to come and say, no, we want to dedicate a lot of time to this and we want to continue to do that and make sure it's consistent, like it wasn't met with any kind of hesitation, like we were able to do it, but just kind of being there and being part of that conversation and being part of like the team that pitched it and made it happen. Like that's something I'm also really proud of.
Okay, so I think there's a question in the chat. How have your workspaces changed pre-summer 2020 to now? How has your work environment changed, if at all? That's a great question.
I'm not the best person to answer because my job changed in the summer of 2020. So, it was virtual the entire time. I think now that I have left Color Change, I do know that, they were providing resources financially for folks to have home offices. So that was a big change. But in terms of like day to day, I think a lot of organizers are still just grinding it out from their homes and really hoping to find balance along the way, but it's hard. There's no real answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, pre-summer 2020, I was at the Post as a fellow, but I was in the office. And I've been working there since. I've been working at home and have kind of set up my little home office. And I mean, like it's some days are better than others. Like some days I'm, kind of happy to be in my little bubble in my apartment. Other times, like I really miss being around other people, and it can be hard to do journalism when so much of it is like that face-to-face interaction and talking with sources and being in the same space as people. And it's been hard to do that virtually. I think we're doing our best and we're still doing a really good job. But that has been, obviously a big change I've had to get used to, just not only physically where I work, but the way that I do my job has changed dramatically.
Can I ask a brief follow-up to that? Just because I don't know if I was as specific as I should have been, but I mean, just in terms of everything that we saw over the summer with the BLM protests after Breonna Taylor and George Floyd were killed, how did that impact the climate of your workspaces? I mean, are there a lot of changes that you can see now that weren't in place before last summer?
Oh, okay, we took it a little too literally. Yeah, I think a good amount of things have changed. There was a lot of kind of pressure last summer on the Post to make a lot of changes, and there was a big list of kind of initiatives that was released. I want to say August, maybe I can't remember, but it was publicly available. And it remains publicly available if anyone's interested in looking at it. But there was a whole kind of list of initiatives. There were like hiring more Black people, kind of giving people within the company more opportunities to try out different beats and different desks and different kind of things within the company and a bunch of other things. I wish I could remember more specifics, but some of those things are happening, and kind of being able to see them is really good. Because like we talked about earlier, it doesn't really mean anything if you make a lot of promises and nothing happens. We have a managing editor for diversity now, which is Krista Thompson, which has been a really great thing to happen, and I'm really happy that that's going on. But there of course is a lot more to be done, and like I said, I think really what came out of last summer was people are more willing to have that conversation and more willing to listen. And so we're really just, I'm in the union at the Post, and people who I work with who are also in the union, we're kind of using this momentum to make sure that the Post is as good of a place it can be, not only for employees but for our readers.
And just to add, I think from my perspective, post summer, in terms of the like social justice space, became a lot more care oriented. I think organizers at large, nonprofits like A Color Change, were just so burnt out from being the primary source for millions of people. So now I'm seeing a lot more intention from HR equivalents, or from leadership teams giving space for people to take time off. Or at my organization, Kairos, we get quarterly weeks off to recharge and to rest, because the work that we're doing is so difficult. I'm used to it now, which might be bad. Like, I'm kind of desensitized to the madness of what's happening, but that's not good. Like, you need to be able to feel the pain of an insurrection. Like, when that happened, I was like, oh no, okay, like that's not a normal reaction. So I think taking time to rest, to reflect, is a priority for a lot of groups. And just taking the time to take a necessary step back to reflect is often misguided and not prioritized. So I'm hoping a lot of organizations in my realm of the work prioritize that, like the ones that I've been blessed enough to be a part of.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think that's awesome that you get like time to like heal. I wish like all workplaces like adapted that model, because I think mental health is so important, and it's so crucial, especially in doing great work. Your mental health has to be there, and I think that that's really awesome. Yeah, there's another question. Now that you're in the working world, what is something that you didn't learn during your time at AU/SOC that you wish you had?
Burnout is a thing, and it is so hard. And if you are an overachiever type, like I prided myself in having, which I don't think is actually healthy. Like, if you pride yourself on grinding it out and like interning and going to class and like going to the library and like coming home late and like doing it over again, that is not sustainable in your real day to day. You need balance, boundaries, self-care. You need to equip yourself with the tools that allow you to be good for those 8 hours of work, and also know when it's time to move on from something and not negotiate yourself in the process of trying to stay at an organization that doesn't serve you anymore. Yeah, I don't think I learned that at AU, but I also don't think in some ways you can learn that at school. You kind of have to learn some of that in the real world, but maybe I can be a like message board to like let you know that it's coming, and that like if you feel burnt out, listen, because it's likely not going to go anywhere. It'll just fester.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. AU has that kind of culture. I mean, I think that's just universities now. It's just like go, go, go all the time. And you graduate, you're exhausted. And then, yeah, I remember like transitioning from college to kind of, I guess like real life, I don't know, like post-grad life, and having too much time at the end of the day, and it was very uncomfortable. And then I was like trying to find things to fill up that time and not having any time to rest and really, recharge myself, and feeling guilty when I did give myself that time. And I think that's kind of what the pandemic has forced a lot of us to do, is be comfortable with being still for a little bit, and I hope that's something that, and I like at my workplace, like my editors are, kind of always reminding us, like, take a mental health day, like it's fine. That's not everyone's experience. And I think I'm very grateful and privileged to be in that position where I can take a day off if I really need to. And I hope that more places do that for their employees, because it's just, like Daniel said, it's unsustainable to kind of like force yourself to work and never give yourself a break. And then I think I mentioned this briefly earlier in our talk, but just kind of advocating for yourself. I don't know how that will be taught, but I think that is something that should be normalized and something that young people should be encouraged to do, is advocating for yourself in meaningful ways, so that when you go to work and there's no one to advocate for you, you don't have like an advisor, you don't have like a beloved professor who's going to always have your back necessarily. So learning how to do that, I think is something that I think young people should learn how to do early on before they go and work in a professional space.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions or anybody that wants to share or ask anything? I have questions forever, so I don't want to take up take up the whole time. All right. I mean, one question also that I do have, yeah, I think this will be probably the last. This will be the last thing. I'll probably wrap it up. Um, so I'll ask two things. One, what are some of the trends that you're seeing for the future in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion in your field? What are some of the ways that your field is like? What trajectory is your field heading into, basically, in terms of diversity? And just any other closing remarks that you have for us, anything that you just want to share to close out. Thank you.
I think that, like any change, it's happening, more slowly than I would like. But I do think even the short amount of time that I have been a journalist, I am seeing that more of that willingness to have conversations that are uncomfortable, more willingness to hold people accountable when they say or do harmful things. And I think, obviously, like the ideal world, my perfect world, we wouldn't have to do that and everyone would just be given a fair shot and things would be completely equitable. But I think the next best thing is just the willingness to have those conversations. And so I think that's kind of where we're at right now. That's where we're headed. And I hope those conversations obviously give way to real change, but I'm glad that they are happening, and I'm grateful to be a journalist at this time when I can be a part of them. And then in terms of like closing remarks, like, I think, I don't know, we covered a lot. This has been a really good, like wide ranging conversation, but if anyone wants to continue this conversation, I can maybe just put my like Twitter handle or something in the chat, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions or want to follow up about anything that we talked about tonight.
Yeah, and I think my final remark of this lovely talk is really just, I think 2020 was the first year I've seen organizing hit a level of mainstream that I just never expected. Like I showed you the example of like the George Floyd SMS texting opt-in. I've done that like 20 times, and that was the only time I've seen it reach 7 million people. But that comes with both amazing opportunities, right, for like political education, but also challenges of the mainstream corporations taking up way too much unnecessary space. So I think we're at a point where we're like entering a new era where there are, people of a new generation, Generation Z, who don't tolerate things, which I'm really excited about, because you shouldn't tolerate things. But I think from an organizing standpoint, there's a lot of work to do in terms of community care and burnout. So I think my final remark is to remember that you cannot do everything all the time, and that there has to be a level of balance. Whether you're a journalist, an organizer, or a PR professional, you cannot keep running the engine. The engine will go on E, and your gas tank will go empty. So just remember to take care of yourself. And by taking care of yourself, you will take care of your community. And by taking care of your community, you will help change the world. And I can drop my Twitter too, although mine is kind of like funny. It's not super professional.
I really appreciate that. I just want to say you both are, Ida B. Wells and Martin Luther King's wildest dreams. You are, they're what they aspired to see for the future for our people. So I'm really proud of you both. I'm happy for you both. And I look forward to seeing where the road takes you. And I hope to be in your footsteps one day doing really amazing work like you both do. So thank you so much for allowing